Lynn, you ready? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Mariner Sands Chapel. It's a community event. I hope you saw the sign out in front. This is for everybody, everybody here in Mariner Sands. If you haven't been to the chapel before, but as I look over across the room, I think you've all been here once or twice before, so you probably know me. But just in case you don't, and for those who are watching on the benefit of our internet, someone may want to watch this at a later time on YouTube, or they might want to connect to our website, marinersands.chapel.org, and they'll see this presentation at a later time. Or if you're like me, some of the things we say tonight you'll forget. And so this will give us an opportunity to provide a little reminder later on, a video reminder. Here at the chapel, we try to create outreach programs for everyone on various topics. We have things on Tuesday nights from time to time. We call them speaker series, and we'll send you some information about that. And oftentimes we can put that in the Mariner Sands Club's highlights and happenings. On Thursdays, that's our night. We usually have concerts when they come around. So you'll be seeing those in the near future as well. Tonight our topic is something that is of near and dear importance, I'm sure, to all of us. Last year when we had the Mariner Sands history, we had some speakers up here talking about our history of Mariner Sands. Brian Barr was here, and one of the things that he said is, we're all in the fourth quarter. And it's kind of funny, kind of not. We are, that's it. So in that sense, that because life is near to us and dear to us, we want to save these years so that all our successes and all our significance is kept pristine right up until the time when we can no longer enjoy this life. And so the title of it is called Keeping Our Dignity at Life's End. The medical community has a unique way of caring for us with our medical needs. When you check into the hospital, they see you as a patient, they identify you and treat you, and they provide whatever medicines or whatever skills that are used to create health so that you can be discharged and go home. If you can't go home, they give you these options to keep you there. And this is the hard part, is how do we know when the decisions to keep you there are guarding your dignity or are causing additional difficulties for your decisions? I'm not going to beat around it. You know what I'm talking about. I'll just tell you a short story, and that is, when my brother died, he was 51 years old, and I was on active duty, and I flew out to California, where he had a heart attack while riding a bicycle in San Francisco area, and he was on life support. He had been left too long, and so his brain never really responded to any kind of care, but they did put a stent in his heart so that his life was sustained. I got out there, and his wife, my sister-in-law, she's Chinese, and she said, "Oh, Gary, I don't understand all these things. You just stay with Michael." And so when I got out to the hospital, they said, "Well, are you ready for us to disconnect his life support?" And it was up to me, the little brother. But I realized from all the reports that the doctors gave is that he was not going to recover, that there was no response from him. His body was alive, but everything that I remembered about my brother was kind of gone at that time. So I said, okay. And so I said, well, how long will it take? They said, given his condition, probably a half an hour, maybe an hour. And I thought, oh, okay. So, a half hour goes by and an hour goes by. And Yulan, my sister-in-law, she says, "Gary, I can't take any more of this. I'm going to go home, and you just tell me, when everything is okay. Or, So I stayed. Hours turned into days. And I stayed with my brother for 4 days in that hospital room. And it just threw me in a whole loop. I had to go see a counselor because I couldn't deal with it. That was just how it was. But I did do one thing right. And that is, whenever the nurses came in, they gave him what we call palliative care. And so I just watched over my brother, and I wiped his forehead when he had a fever, and I talked to him, and I read to him, and I prayed to him, prayed for him, and sang. I don't know if he got any of it, but I gave him the best 4 days I could. But that's what got me on a new journey to say, look, we have got to be thinking about how can we keep other people's dignity at the end of life. And so I've been to different hospitals, all the hospitals in the area. I've had the unfortunate experience, as you know, that people here at Mariner Sands have passed away, and I've been able to visit them just before their death. So tonight, Dr. Tony Nehra is going to talk to us about all the medical concerns regarding keeping your dignity at the end of life. My portion is really more as your chaplain. Not so much religious concerns, but just things that are kind of medical, but really kind of your decisions. Like on the back wall, over by our first aid kit on the wall, you see over here on the back on your left, there's a little blue pamphlet there called 5 Wishes. And that is something that is authorized in Florida. If you have not ever made what we call an advance directive, it's a decision that you say, if I am going into the hospital, these are the things that I want. These are the things that I don't want. And it goes through various questions to ask that you can fill out, sign at the very end, and that will be your advance directive. That will be an advance decision while you can make decisions, so that your child or your spouse won't have to guess at those decisions. So that's something that we have. I also want to advertise something that I think is very unique and special that I don't know where it is going on anywhere else. But I'll say this. From here on out, as I'm looking around the room, when there comes a time where you want to talk about this, I offer you what I call a crucial conversation. You call the chaplain and say, Gary, I'd like to have a crucial conversation with you. And there you and I together will sit in my study and we'll go over things that you just need to talk about. And the way it works is I'll take as much time as you need, and we'll jot down your preferences of what you'd like. And then we'll sit with that for a month or 2 months, and then just have a brief meeting after that 2 months where you've had a chance to think about all those things and say, yeah, that's about right. And then you will have a document that you can share with your children or anybody else, and you can let them know, I've had a crucial conversation. Now, I've done this with 5 people here at Mariner Sands, and I won't say their names because I want to guard their privacy, but I can tell you, each of those 5 are so relieved that they had that conversation. And we'll talk about everything. Do you have a will? Do you have an advance directive? How do you plan to do, this, that, and the other? And we'll just chat about how you want things to go. And that way, it's just between you and me and God Almighty, but it gives you a chance to do that. And I'll call that a crucial conversation. So I want to give you an opportunity. What do you want? That's your time. Toward the end, after Tony is finished, I'll mention something about one of the highest rates of death in Martin County, and that is suicide. For those in our age group, suicide is one of the major causes, and I'll talk about that a little later on, of things to look for and how to prevent it. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tony Nehra, one of our residents. He is a board-certified OB/GYN physician. He has graduated from Georgetown and Wayne State University Medical School, if I remember right. He's a great friend, and not too bad a golfer, and he's going to come and talk to you now. So thank you. Let's welcome Dr. Nehra.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. My daughter, Therese, typed up this presentation for me since I'm only quasi-computer literate, but I have to take responsibility for the typos. I can't blame Sister Jean Christopher or Sister Helen George, my first and second grade teachers. It's my fault. I found one typo, but then when I went through it the second time, I found more, and I decided I'm not going to ask my daughter to redo it. There's a novella called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's written by Leo Tolstoy in the 1880s. And it's a story about a bureaucrat in Russia who's a lawyer, a judge in a town. And he's a man about town and well-known, well-respected. He develops an illness, and the doctors have no idea what's the matter with him. His family can't figure out what's the matter with him. So his doctors, his family, and his friends stop visiting. So he's in bed, and it's a fatal illness. And the only person that's with him is his servant, his butler, called Garrison. And Garrison sat with him day after day after day. And he raised his legs and would hold them for hours, because that's the only thing that brought him relief. So this is an example of the ministry of presence, which we'll talk about later. But it's also an example of compassion. And compassion is a virtue or feeling. It's a deep awareness of the suffering of others. And it brings about caring, which is an action. And caring is when we show concern and kindness to others. And this is the basic foundation of what we're going to talk about tonight. And I brought my iPad up because I don't want to keep turning so I can see the slides here. So we have to go through a little data to understand what we're going to talk about later. So the first slide talks about our total population today. It's about 336 million people in the U.S. And as you can see, in 2010, there were 40 million people aged 65 and older, and now it's about 56 million. And in 2050, there'll be a population of about 390 million and 80 million people over 65, which is more than 20% of the population. Today, there are as many 50-year-olds as 5-year-olds, and in 2050, there'll be as many 80-year-olds as 5-year-olds. And about 10,000 people turn 65 every day in the U.S. So the population is aging, clearly. When I look in the mirror, I can see that. The life expectancy has changed greatly, as I think we all know. In the past, most people died at home and died young. There wasn't very much of a thing as old age. And people died of natural causes. Tuberculosis, infection, often influenza, cancers that we cure readily today. If you talk to your parents, those of us who are my age and older, almost every one of our parents have a sibling or an aunt or an uncle who died very young. My father had a brother who died as an infant. My mother had an aunt and a cousin who died very young from influenza, and several other relatives that were damaged by influenza. So today, actually life expectancy has gone down a little in the last few years due to COVID, but it's still significant when you compare it to 1900 when it was less than 50, and today for women it's 79 and men it's 73.2. So the increased longevity brought about a lot of change, and the increased longevity brought change in relationships between the young and the old. And the young and the old want independence now. They want freedom. And this kind of independence changed the way we live. And it brought about rising incomes. It brought about a concept called retirement, which wasn't really much of a concept back 50 years ago. It brought about senior communities, places like Mariner Sands, Sun City, Arizona. For parents and children, it brought about separation, and the separation was all about freedom. And Dr. Gawande, Atul Gawande, whose book I would recommend highly, Being Mortal, talked about modern times didn't demote the elderly, but demoted the family. The young and the old have a way of life with a greater degree of liberty and control. And in the early 1900s, people over 65, there were 60% of people over 65 who had a young person living with them. And today it's hardly anybody. There were also, today, we have a thing that Dr. Gawande talks about, the veneration of independence. But the independence misses the reality of life's progress. There's a time when the independent will become dependent. All of us will become dependent because of either serious illness or infirmity. Dr. Catherine Mannix, who's a palliative care specialist, whose book I also would recommend, With the End in Mind, she's from England, she talks about the death rate being 100%. And she also talks about there's only 2 days where a person lives less than 24 hours. One of them we celebrate every year, and the other one is the reason we think life is so precious. Dr. Silverstone, Felix Silverstone, was a geriatrician, and he talked about the fears of elders. And one of the fears include reducing independence, the loss of hearing, the loss of memory, loss of friends. I remember my father talking a lot about all his friends are gone. He's 100 now, so all his friends are gone. And loss becomes a way of life. And Silverstone said, old age is a continuous series of losses. So in the 1800s and the first part of the last century, there were places called poorhouses. And poorhouses were places where the destitute and some old people lived because the families couldn't afford to take care of them. But most people who were elderly were taken care of at home, and they often died at home. But hospitals became not a place where people feared, but a place of cure as medicine became more adept at handling various illnesses. But hospitals couldn't solve the problems of debilities and chronic illness and advancing age. So the concept of a nursing home came about. And there were changes in the law that occurred in the early 50s, but primarily with Medicare, which supported and paid for places like nursing homes. But nursing homes were designed to provide safety, and it wasn't the same thing as living. And Irving Goffman, who's a sociologist who's well known from Canada, talked about nursing homes were like prisons, military bases, and mental hospitals. And we'll talk more about nursing homes a little bit. So how can you avoid a nursing home? Well, the best way to avoid a nursing home is to have family as the primary alternative. Family that's able to take care of you. And there's also, paid and volunteer help can also help that. A study by Merrill Lynch found there's $500 billion of annual free care that takes place in the U.S. Most of it by families. So when we talk about families and caregivers, we have a problem now because the supply is decreasing. And it's decreasing because children live far away from their parents. There's fewer children in families. Many children are working. There's often a situation of the sandwich generation where someone who's in their 40s is taking care of a 5-year-old and occasionally taking care of their parent who's 70 or 80. And there's also, with greater amount of divorce and many families not having children, that's going to decrease the amount of caregivers. So the private sector care is definitely available, but it's very limited and expensive. So I have 3 examples here of people who, 2 people stayed at home and 1 person helped with a child that lived far away. So Viva Jane Noel was from Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The golfers here know who came from Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Arnold Palmer, right. But who else came from Latrobe, Pennsylvania? The most famous neighbor of all, Fred Rogers. So Viva Jane Noel was 93 years old. She had visual difficulty and lived alone. And she feared most going to a nursing home. She did not want to go to a nursing home. She wanted to stay home. She wanted to take care of her garden. She wanted to dust her curios. So she became involved with Mary Ann Colson. And Mary Ann Colson was part of a volunteer group called Laurel Volunteers in Action. I think Latrobe is Laurel Valley in Pennsylvania. So Mary Ann would have dinner with Vi Jean a couple times a week and always go out and celebrate her birthday. And the problem with this volunteer group is even though they volunteer, they need funds to help finance their work. And as someone in the group, in that particular group said, when you spend money on children, it's an investment. When you spend it on old people, it's an expense. So the second example, it isn't someone staying home, but someone that helps. Norm Wine was 80 years old. He lived in Pittsburgh. He was divorced in 1976. He and his wife had one child who lived in California. His wife was Karen. Karen was in a memory facility because of dementia. Norm would visit her at least once a week. And he'd take pictures and he'd call his daughter and tell her how her mom was doing. Norm did that to help his daughter who lived in California, but he also did it because his parents, who had been in New Jersey, his father had dementia and his mother was disabled, were cared for by a neighbor, and he felt this is one way to pay back. The third example is Marcus Waller, who's this is Chicago. His mother is Melinda Butler. So Marcus was a postal worker, and he had his own place, but his mother was disabled with rheumatoid arthritis. So he moved in with his mother. He became his mother's caretaker. He would come home from work, he'd buy dinner, he'd have dinner together with his mother. If it was nice outside, he'd take a walk with his mom. They'd usually watch a movie, and then he'd help her up the stairs because she had rheumatoid arthritis. It was hard for her to walk, it was hard for her to hold on to the walls. He'd get her undressed, he'd put her in the shower, he'd get her dressed and put her in bed. And his fellow workers would say, a man's not supposed to do that. But Marcus said, you do what you have to do. So he learned from his mother because his mother had sponsored, his mother was from Panama originally, would take him and his brother back to Panama or to some of the islands to visit relatives. And she sponsored a number of people from Panama to become citizens in the U.S. She also went to work at 2 a.m. every morning as a caregiver. She'd come home, get her boys ready for school, and then she'd go to 2 other jobs. So from his mother, he learned how to care. So what happens when we need more help than this? So we have several options. And one of the options is nursing home, which we mentioned earlier. And nursing homes are also known as skilled nursing facilities, and they provide 24/7 care for seniors and sometimes disabled people requiring medical support. Assisted living is kind of an intermediate station, and it's a housing facility for people with disabilities or for adults who cannot or choose not to live independently. And it's a group environment, as I'm sure we all know, and it typically caters to the elderly. So when we talk about these kind of facilities, there's a lot of regimentation, there's not much freedom. So some people have come up with alternatives through the years. Karen Brown Wilson is a nursing home abolitionist. She was one of the originators of assisted living. So she was from West Virginia. Her father died when she was 9. Her father was a coal miner, and her mother was a washerwoman. So her mother, when she went off to college, her mother had a terrible stroke, and her mother was seriously disabled. She was paralyzed. She couldn't walk. She didn't have use of her left arm. She had difficulty speaking, but her mind was fine. So when she would visit her in the nursing home, her mom would tell Karen, take me home, get me out of here. So Karen became and she had siblings, but the siblings were not able to care for her mother, so her mother ended up in a nursing home. So Karen became interested in gerontology. She married a sociologist. He encouraged her to continue her studies. She got a PhD in gerontology, and she and her husband founded a place in Portland that was called Park Place. And Park Place called the residents tenants. They were able to lock the doors. They were able to control their heat. They were able to stay up late and watch TV. They could get up late. There was staff there to help them where needed. And as they became more disabled, there was more staff and more family care. people criticized this. They said, this is not safe. This is not an appropriate environment. People are going to hurt themselves. Well, ultimately, after 5 years, what they found was there was increased life satisfaction, the health was maintained, physical and cognitive function improved, depression levels were less, and the costs were 20% decreased. So that was a successful situation, and several more homes were built in Portland because of this. An even more amazing person is Bill Thomas. Bill Thomas was of upstate New York. Every sales contest that he entered, he won as a kid. And he said, I learned to accept being turned down, but I kept selling. So in high school, Bill had poor grades, but he read voraciously, and he was autodidact. And he was a leader. He was president of his class, and he was captain of the track team. He went to State University of New York. One of the teachers told him, you're going to be home by December pumping gas, because he had done poorly in school. He thought he wanted to be a gym teacher, and he took a biology course, and he became very interested in medicine. So he ended up with a 4-point average at the university, became president of his class, and was accepted to Harvard Medical School. The guy was going to go home pumping gas. He did well at Harvard Medical School. He went back to upstate New York, became a family practitioner. He married a nurse named Jude, and they had 5 kids. He bought a farm because he wanted to be self-sufficient. Ultimately, he grew to 400 acres. So he could be with his family and run the farm. He became an ER doctor, and he worked nights. But after a while, it became tedious and difficult. So he took a position at a nursing home as director of the nursing home. Nursing home had 80 beds, and half the people were physically disabled, and 80% had cognitive disability, and some had Alzheimer's. So Bill looks at the place, and he thought, there's no life here. And he thought, well, I can fix this. He thought about, he's a doctor, he thought about, there must be a medical solution. Maybe people are being drugged too much. But then he figured out the place was missing life. And he wanted to go after the 3 plagues of nursing homes: boredom, loneliness, and helplessness. So what Bill did is he thought, I'm going to bring life into this nursing home. So he put a plant in every room. He put a bird in every room. He brought dogs in. People would walk dogs. He brought cats in. He turned the lawn into flower and vegetable gardens. People brought their kids in after school. Ultimately, a daycare was present at this particular place. And Bill had to do a lot of selling to the state of New York and the county to get these changes done, but he was a great salesman. So what happened? Prescriptions decreased by 50%. Psychotropic drugs, the kinds that treat anxiety and depression, those decreased greatly, and deaths were 15% less. And Bill felt the reason was that people ultimately had a reason to live. So Bill went on, he and his wife went on and found many other places, and there's other places that came about that were similar in Boston and Athens, Ohio. So there was a philosopher named Josiah Royce who talked about the principle of loyalty. And he said, when an individual finds a cause judged worthwhile, his or her will becomes focused and defined. And furthermore, the individual becomes allied with a community of others who are also committed to that same cause. Royce called this commitment loyalty. Unless the moral life of an individual is understood in terms of the multiple loyalties that a person embraces. So being housed, fed, and alive is not enough. Without a cause beyond ourselves, these things are meaningless. So loyalty is an intrinsic human need. Dr. Gawande talked about the fact that our stories are always changing. So despite the limits and travails we encounter, we want freedom. We want to be the authors of our own lives. It's a key to being human. He said that our bodies will fail as well as our minds, but the battle of being mortal is one of maintaining the integrity of one's life. So what happens when we continue to go downhill, when there's a downward progression? When is it acceptable to fix? When is it acceptable to let go? That's a crucial question. So in the U.S., and it's no different in any other country, but 25% of our spending for health care goes for only for 5% of patients during the final year of life. And that, I don't say that to be critical, I'm just saying that that's a fact. So we predict poorly, as physicians especially, we predict poorly how much time people have left. It's said that we overestimate the amount of time people have left by 530%. So it's a pretty bad odds if you're making a bet. Ira Byatt is another person that I found his writings to be very helpful. And he's a palliative care and hospice physician, I think in New Hampshire. So he talked about spending one's final days attached to a ventilator in the ICU for many is a kind of failure. And he wrote a book that was called 4 Things That Matter the Most. And there's no chance when you're attached to a ventilator to say the 4 things that matter the most, which are, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. So Gawande talked about people with illnesses, serious illnesses have other priorities rather than just prolonging life. They want to avoid suffering. They want to strengthen relationships with family and friends. They want to be mentally aware. They don't want to be a burden. And they want to achieve a sense that their life is complete. So technology often fails to meet these needs, and the cost is a lot more than just dollars. So we have to remember that as caregivers and as family members. So what can be done? So there's a concept, there's a type of care called palliative care. And to qualify, you just need to be seriously ill and you need help with symptoms. There's no determination that a patient's dying or has limited time. Palliative care is multidisciplinary. It involves physicians, nurses, social workers, chaplains, counselors, aides, physical therapists. And it often, it's there to help manage the side effects of treatment. And the focus is the whole person and the family and the quality of life. It understands the fundamental nature of illness is personal. For physicians, often illness is another problem, another medical problem. It's a problem to fix. And often what's missed is the fundamental nature of illness is personal. And the goals for palliative care are for now and when and if a condition deteriorates. And the goals of palliative care are to bring physical comfort. So someone might need a hospital bed, pain relief, eating and drinking, help people with nausea, help problems avoiding and toileting, help bowel issues, bring a bedside commode to the house, help people sleep, help people ambulate. Some people need walkers. So with the family and the individual that they're treating, you want clarity in goals and their priorities, you want to lessen conflict and help with treatment decisions so that as things deteriorate more, people and caregivers know what you want. You've had a conversation. So when people are in palliative care, the ultimate result is you live longer. When you live longer, often you live better. And you tolerate advanced treatments with less side effects. You can stay in treatment longer. And when treatment's intolerable, it helps people to live well and for as long as possible. So the team is there to meet the urgent needs. There's no assumptions. They want to know, what do you fear? And they want to know, what do you want? What are your desires? So the next step for some people is hospice. I would highly recommend, if you don't know anything about hospice, read about Dame Cicely Saunders, who was an Englishwoman who's the founder of hospice. It's an amazing story. And that's how I really first learned about hospice, was to write about Cicely Saunders. So hospice is a service for when you or your loved ones and your doctor decide treatments to cure or slow disease are no longer working, and you're ready to stop, and your doctor can make a referral to hospice. So hospice has a philosophy that you matter because you are you. You matter until the last moment of life. Usually, death is expected within 6 months, but as we talked about, prediction is not very accurate. Many are in hospice longer. Medicare requires that patients forego curative treatment. So if you're on chemotherapy for cancer and you go into hospice, you have to stop that treatment. Some hospices require that, but it's really a Medicare requirement. Most people that go into hospice are Medicare age or Medicare insured, but not all. So hospice also is a multidisciplinary focus, as palliative care was. And what the goals are is freedom from pain, maintain medical awareness as long as possible, and getting out and about when possible. So the mantra for hospice is live for now. When the nurse comes to see you, she says, I'm the hospice nurse. Here's what I have to offer to make your life better. I know we don't have a lot of time. So there's a lot of misconceptions about hospice. Hospice doesn't mean doing nothing. It doesn't mean you're giving up hope. The problem with many people that go into hospice is the referral is way too late. Median time in hospice is 16 to 21 days, but many patients are there in less than 3 days. So we can be shortening and worsening the time we have by choosing treatments that are almost certain to fail. Rarely is there not something left to try, but sometimes it's better to be like General Lee and surrender and not be General Custer. So there are some new approaches with Aetna and MD Anderson where treatment was continued. These are studies, and hospice and palliative care were offered to the people in these studies. And the MD Anderson study is interesting because took care of 4,500 people who had terminal illness, and half were in hospice and half were not in hospice. And it extended life, pancreatic cancer by 3 weeks, lung cancer by 6 weeks, and congestive heart failure by 3 months. Someone might say, that's not a lot of time, but it may be the time to say the 4 things that matter the most. So there's 2 interesting stories I'm going to present. Most of you probably remember who Art Buchwald was. So Art Buchwald is a columnist for the Washington Post. He was a national columnist, and he was the drollest person ever. And when I was in college, I read the Washington Post every day, and often after the sports page, I went to read Art Buchwald first, or next, I should say. So in 2006, Art Buchwald was suffering from peripheral vascular disease, and he was supposed to have a leg amputation, and he refused. He also had kidney failure, and he was recommended to go on dialysis. He refused. So he went into hospice. So he's admitted to hospice, and he was there for 5 months, and he had visitors from authors and politicians, and he dreamt about a big funeral and, New York Times obituary, and Buchwald kept getting better. And after 5 months, he left hospice. I heard him interviewed on the radio, and he said, I fired hospice. So he did a book tour. He wrote a book that was called Too Soon to Say Goodbye. And he credited hospice with helping him get better. And ultimately, he died, but he was able to write another book and tour the country and enjoy his life. Dr. Bayak had a patient named Mickey Zimbel. And Zimbel had retired early. He was a very successful businessman. He loved to play golf. He retired so he could play golf and enjoy his family. He had survived prostate cancer and a recurrence. He'd survived breast cancer, and he survived melanoma. But he was suffering from liver cancer, and he had lots of tumors on his liver and a lot of pain from the tumors. He had severe swelling of his legs. He could hardly walk. Palliative care saw him, Dr. Bayak, and they changed some medications and treated him for several different things. and he started to feel better. And a week later, Dr. Byack goes to visit him, and he's got his golf shorts on. And, but he still was too weak. Dr. Byack didn't want to send him home because he felt he'd come right back to the hospital. So he talked to him about hospice. And initially, his wife and he were reluctant, and they felt like he was giving up, but they finally agreed to hospice. So he was treated with some different things, including steroids. It shrunk the tumors in his liver. It reduced the swelling. He felt a lot better. His anemia improved, he claimed, because he started to love chocolate-covered raisins. Raisins have a lot of iron, but I don't think that much. So through the course of the summer, his symptoms lessened and he left hospice. So he felt so good, he went down to Florida. He went into Florida, he played golf, had a wonderful time. By the next spring, his cancer recurred and he ultimately died. His wife said he had a wonderful quality of life because of hospice and palliative care. She was emphatic that the quality of life and the length of life were connected. So we have to remember, death is still the ultimate enemy. Its forces are superior. It always wins. And as Gawande said, as I mentioned before, it's better to be Lee and surrender when you can. So I had two personal instances. And some of you watch the Hallmark Channel, I'm sure. It's always on when I visit my parents. So there's a movie on the Hallmark Channel called The Color of Rain, and there's also a book. The movie's based on the book, and it's about people that I know and my wife knows. Matt was 35 years old, and his family had a deletion called P35 deletion, which you don't have the gene that protects you from a lot of cancers. So many males in his family died of sarcoma, which is a disease of the muscle and connective tissue and bone. His father was a year older than me, died of it, and I sat by his bedside many days, and he had undergone chemotherapy for sarcoma, and the chemotherapy for sarcoma is miserable. It hardly ever succeeds, and the side effects are terrible. So his dad looked about 30 or 40 years older than me, and he was 1 year older than me, and he ultimately died. So Matt had a sarcoma treated successfully in his 20s, and then it came back, and it was a pretty aggressive tumor, and he was 35, and he was a general manager of a major, as his dad was, a general manager of a major television station in Detroit. And he was a very strong Christian. He was part of an accountability group that 4 of us would meet once a week. So Matt and I had a long conversation, and I said, it's okay to choose not to be treated, because the results are not very successful, and you might live better, and you might live longer. So Matt had 2 young boys. So he worked for a while during that time, and then he made videos for his boys, and toward the end, he had trouble breathing. He actually entered hospice, was on oxygen. His desire was to get to Christmas Eve service, and he did, and he died the next day. So this is an example where it's okay to choose hospice, and it's okay to choose not to be treated. And he really had a good year. He had a very good year, and he was very able up until the last few days of his life. So there's one other situation. I'll call this is a patient of mine, call her Jay. So Jay had a cancer of the uterus, which most of the time you treat it, you live a normal life. But hers was a very aggressive kind of cancer, and she kept having recurrences, and she kept being treated with more chemo, and she got sicker and sicker. So I visited her and her husband on a Sunday night in the hospital, and the oncologist was about to start her 4th course of chemotherapy, and I just really became knowledgeable about hospice. And I sat down and we talked, and I said, it's okay to choose not to be treated. It's okay to go home and to go into hospice. And she and her husband were very receptive to that, and they did. And she died about 6 months later, her husband, who was very quiet, reticent kind of guy, sent me a beautiful letter, which I still have. And he said, during the 6 months, we traveled. And we became closer than we'd ever been. They did not have children. And it was like, this is very reinforcing that you need to talk, for me, that you need to talk to people about more than one more treatment and one more treatment and one more treatment. So I felt, I was divinely inspired in these two situations because, it's not situations I'd ever dealt with before. And typically in my kind of medicine, you don't deal with it. So I think that there's a lot more to dealing with sickness than always choosing another treatment and another treatment, because sometimes it may be harmful. So what do we need to do when we're moving on in life? So we need to be considering things like advanced directives. So advanced directives designate who should make decisions for you if you're unable to communicate what you want. So you need to have a conversation with people, and you need to designate who you want to make those decisions for you. The person has to be 18. You have to have 2 witnesses. They can't be your wife. They can't be your doctor. Can't be your insurance company. And they can't be the people giving you care. And it's legal in Florida to have an advance directive. But most important thing is to have the conversation. And we'll talk about what the conversation entails in a little bit. A living will describes the kind of treatment that you might want. The idea of a living will is changing because things change. And it's important to have the discussion with people who are your family, people that are going to be speaking on your behalf in case you're disabled. Charles Grottheimer, this is a typo here, most of you know as a political commentator. Charles was also a psychiatrist. And he wrote an article before he actually was at the end of his life, talking about how he felt it was better not to have a living will, but to have the conversation and to designate people, often family, who can help make the decisions if you're unable to make the decision. A DNR, or do not resuscitate order, is another type of document you may choose to have or not have. And what that says is you don't want cardiopulmonary resuscitation, you don't want chest compression, you don't want intubation or tube in your throat to help you breathe. The conversation entails, if your heart stops, what do you want? Do you want chest compression? If you stop breathing, what do you want? Do you want intubation? Do you want a tube in your throat? Do you want mechanical ventilation? Do you want someone breathing for you? Do you want IV or tube feedings? Do you want antibiotics? I mean, these are things that people who you trust need to know. The Cross Wisconsin had a high cost of end-of-life care. And there was a movement in the town to have people have advanced directives. And over 3 or 4 years, 85% of the people had advanced directives. So, and when people came to the hospital, someone came and spent time with them and went over what do they want. So there can be an organized movement to do these kinds of things. Maybe that's something we can do in Mariner Sands, if people haven't done it. So the key questions are, if time is short, what's important to you? What concerns do you have about what lies ahead? What concerns do you have about pain, about mental awareness, about your family, and who make the decisions for you? So when you have the conversation, it's difficult. And it unleashes significant emotions. And it takes time. It's not something that you can do in a hurry. I mean, as Gary mentioned, you talk about it, but you also talk about it again. It's not something you decide quickly. It's easier to treat somebody than to take the time to find out what they want. It takes time to have a conversation. If a caregiver knows what's important to you, then it's easier for the caregiver to present options to you. So clinicians often fear doing too little, but equally terrible mistakes happen by doing too much. So that's something, it's really important to remember. The next thing we'll talk about is physician-assisted suicide. It's legal in 9 states in the District of Columbia, and it's legal in 10 countries, including the U.S., in some states. And it's defined as suicide committed with the aid of another person. It is a form of euthanasia, which is the deliberate ending of a life. In 2012, 1 in 35 Dutch people sought physician-assisted suicide. So the Netherlands and Belgium are two countries that were earliest in passing the law allowing physician-assisted suicide. So as Gawande says, the ultimate goal is not a good death, but a good life to the end. And assisted living is far harder than assisted death, but its possibilities are far greater as well. There's an extra E in there, so hopefully you'll notice that. Suffering's unavoidable, and it's difficult, but we suffer as a society if we let providing the capacity to help people die divert us from improving the lives of the ill. So Dr. Mannix talked about how where physician-assisted suicide is legal, it brings about unintended pressure. And I'm going to mention two examples. So Eric was a principal in England who was a very efficient guy. He felt like he was the kind of guy that got things done. He was an organizer. And like many professionals, he sacrificed time with his family for work. He was getting close to retirement. And he developed a motor neuron disease, similar to ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. So he read about it on the internet, and it's horrifying. So he decided he was going to kill himself. So he first decided he was going to fake a car accident. But he found his hands were too weak to control the shift, so he couldn't do that. So he thought, I'm going to go to my doctor, Dr. Mannix, and see if she'll give me drugs. Well, she told him she wasn't going to do that, and besides, in England it was illegal. So he thought, so he developed pneumonia because he had trouble swallowing. And he thought, well, I can allow myself to die by not eating. And he decided, no, I can't do that. And his greatest fear was choking in front of other people, especially his children. That was his greatest fear. So after lots of conversation, he allowed himself to have a feeding tube, and he chewed out a little food just for taste, because he loved eating. And he also loved Christmas. But it was the fall, and he wasn't going to live till Christmas. So his family and his doctor and people that took the caregivers decided to have an early Christmas, and he loved it. It was great. It was in the hospital, and it was a highlight of his life. And he told Dr. Mannix, "I'm glad I didn't kill myself earlier. It would have been too soon. I would have missed so much. I had no idea that I'd be able to tolerate such a changed life. People need to understand this. You need to understand this. I wanted to die before something happened that I couldn't bear, but I didn't die. And the thing I dreaded happened, but I found I could bear it. I wanted euthanasia, and no one could do it. I would have missed Christmas. I was angry because you said no to assistance with dying. But you were really saying yes to living. I get that now. I'm a teacher. You need to tell other people this from me." Excuse me. I'm talking too much, right? Dr. Mannix had another patient, Ujal. Ujal was a young man who grew up in England. He moved to the Netherlands because he became a manager in an oil company. And he was married and a young child, 1-year-old Tabitha. After her first birthday, he developed a terrible disease called rectal sarcoma. And as you talked about sarcomas earlier, that don't have a great prognosis. So he had several surgeries, and his intestines were leaking inside his abdomen, and he had lots of tubes, and also had some radiation. But he was happy to be alive and wanted to spend whatever time he had at home with his wife and daughter. His doctor, who was a professor, said, many people wouldn't want to live in this state. Usually agreed, but it was the only way to be alive was the way he was. He wanted to do it, and he wanted to do it at home. So he was offered euthanasia every day, despite the fact that he was eating small meals. His wounds were healing, and all his various bags were functioning. He began to dread doctor visits. Finally, he insisted on going home to England, and he was admitted to hospice. And a daybed was established in the hospital for his wife and a cot for his daughter. He was fitted with an electric wheelchair. He took his daughter for rides all around. In the hospital, the hospice team made him more comfortable with special dressings and pain control. And he explained to one of his staff, the staff that was caring for him, that he received expert care in the Netherlands, but his critique was there was a subtle but unintended nuance in every conversation to euthanize once his cancer had spread. Once euthanasia was brought up persistently, he was afraid to bring up any new symptoms in case only euthanasia and not symptom management was recommended. So he felt the conversation always had a tone of helplessness and hopelessness. And he perceived a preference to control the uncertainty by accelerating his death. And he ran away from certainty-controlled dying to live in the hope of uncertainty. And he lived 2 months. And during that time, his daughter developed a British accent. So as Dr. Mannix points out, once you let the euthanasia genie out of the bottle, you have to be careful what you wish for. So Dr. Bayak talks about physician-assisted suicide as a poor proxy for how we die and how best to care for people at life's end. Those of us who have a religious background found opposition to hastening death in their morals. For those in the medical community who don't have a religious bent, there's a profound respect for life that clinicians share with theologians and clerics. To honor and care for the vulnerable is a defining trait of humanity. And to fully and authentically affirm life, we must affirm all of life, including dying, death, and grief. Cardinal Joseph Bernardin was the Cardinal of Chicago, and he was dying of pancreatic cancer. And he wrote a letter to the U.S. Supreme Court. He said, I'm at the end of my life. There's much I've contemplated in these last few months of my illness. As one dying, I've come to appreciate the gift of life. I know from my experience that patients face difficult and personal decisions. I also know that a patient who decides to forego treatment does not necessarily choose death. Rather, they choose life without the burden of disproportionate medical intervention. So one can be pampered even when they're near death. Along with love, we need science, we need technology, good judgment, and sound policy. But the greatest of these is love. You probably know who wrote that. So, in conclusion, as life's end approaches, people want to share their memories. They want to pass on wisdom and keepsakes and settle relationships and establish legacies. They want to make peace with God and ensure those left behind will be okay. They want their stories to end on their own terms. They want to be able to say, please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you, and I love you. It's shameful when we deny people this role. In medicine, we can inflict deep wounds at life's end and can be oblivious to that kind of harm. To be human is to be limited. The role of caring professionals ought to be aiding people in their struggles with these limits. Sometimes we will offer a cure, sometimes a salve. Always we must care. The tendency to professionalize basic care and social support is well intended, but it's insidious. It can complicate care for those who are old, dying, and grieving. It can erode the core cultural roles and suppress the caregiving skills residing within families and communities. The dying are our friends. Some we played with as children. There are siblings with whom we laughed, stayed up late, rode our bikes. There are spouses with whom we shared the most intimate moments, tragedies and joys. There are mothers who cared for us, who carried us in their wombs, comforted us, nursed us, soothed our hurts, dried our tears, and wiped our rear ends. And there are fathers who encouraged us, watched our games, and taught us by example. We owe them our time and our presence through life, especially at life's end. Baby boomers participated in a movement that made childbirth a family-centered event. This was largely consumer-driven, but consequently, fathers are at all deliveries, babies stay with their moms, and breastfeeding is encouraged. As we age and we care for our parents and loved ones, and as we approach our own dying, the baby boomer generation can take back the essential personal experience of dying, as well as caring for a loved one as they die. As was done with childbearing, the responsibility for care for the people we know and love can and should be ours. We can expect expert medical care and not to be abandoned when cure is not possible. Care that is consistent with our preference and needs. Our care can comfort and allow people to feel wanted, worthy, and dignified during their terminal frailty. Death lies bare at the spiritual core of the human. Impending demise strips all pretenses. Privilege and sacred are words that we often use when speaking of birth and death. This is true whether one's religious or not. For those in healthcare, the doors of the sacred open at times of birth and death. The healthiest response to death is to love, honor, and respect life. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Okay. We're going to finish up in just a second. I'll just let you know, with regards to the local statistics here in our country, 2020 is the latest statistics that we have regarding suicides in America. You can go to your local health department. There are other national websites that give us those statistics. In 2020, that was like I say, the most recent statistics, 45,979 people took their lives. And that was just the number that the medical examiner could quantify in the death certificate. There are many others that were accidental. There were many others that died of other causes that the medical examiner chose not to place on the death certificate. And those are the deaths. Then there are the violent acts that people go to a hospital for, which are ideations or activities that are trying or attempts to end their life. And then there are the ideations. I'll leave you with these thoughts. Not on a dark thought, I'm going to give you some suicide awareness. We look at each other, we see each other at the club, and we see each other in the different venues for our athletic and sports interests. So as you look at someone, there are many things that are going on in our lives, and you may hear one or two things that have been a setback. And if you notice a change in their demeanor, their personality, if you notice a change in their health, if they've recently been to an emergency room and they're back, if they've had a recent setback financially. These are all certain small little streams that really may not in themselves mean any one thing, but when things start building up and more mitigating small things start coming together, what people start thinking, they have a conversation in their mind, and they say, you know, if I take myself out of the problem will go away. Now that's false thinking, but as you're looking at someone, I want you to notice when you listen to other people, your neighbors and your friends, see if there's a tell. You know what a tell is? You know when people play cards, they give a little tell? You know when someone says, hey, I got a full house, you know, or whatever. When there's a tell, it's an invitation to you to respond. You know, we all get wedding invitations, right? And on a wedding invitation, what does it say? RSVP. Please respond. And so when you notice something that's not quite right, that may be a change in their personality, or they're not showing up, they're isolating themselves more often than not, or they seem to be kind of indifferent to all the things. They're not happy, they're not sad, they just are indifferent. These are tells. And to be alert to those tells, the next thing you would do is just ask them. Some people wonder, well, if I ask them if they're thinking about suicide, that might influence them to commit suicide. The answer is just the opposite. That asking is a great relief. As a matter of fact, your attitudes about death, if you say, oh, well, I don't believe in suicide, the thing is if you don't believe in that, your attitude about that may influence the person who's thinking about it. Just in the same way, if someone who says, oh, I don't have any problem with suicide, that too is an attitude that influences a person. So just ask. I noticed that you haven't been around lately. You haven't been showing up. Seems like your health has been in decline, that I've noticed. And by the way, you just seem so indifferent to everything. I'm just curious. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? And you'll notice that there are two responses. One is if they are thinking about suicide, you'll see an immediate relief on their face that someone has just understood their situation. It's a relief to be able to say that to someone. If they're not thinking about suicide, they will say, no, I'm not thinking about suicide. But they're glad you asked. They're glad you asked. So be alert to the signs and then ask. If they are, the first aid that you can provide is this. Listen to them. Listen to their story. Oftentimes people who are thinking about killing themselves are looking at the past. They're looking at something hopeless. They say there's nothing forward to live for. As you listen to their story, listen for one key thing that might be a way of hope, a turnaround point. And say, well, what about this? Maybe it's a loved one. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe it's something, a commitment. Maybe it's waiting for Christmas. Maybe it's just something. All we have to do is keep them safe for now. That's first aid for people who are at risk for suicide. It works in millions of places around the world. There's a company or an organization called Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. This is what they tell. This is how they teach it. They use the acronym TALK, T-A-L-K. The tell, the ask, the listening, and keep them safe for now. In Martin County, 2020 statistics, only 6 people below the age of 25 killed themselves. Conversely, those over the age of 55, 66. So you can see that in our age group, it's a concern that we should be just aware of. We are a community, and sometimes we get so absorbed in our own lives. I'd like you to just say, why don't you take a look around? There's so many wonderful people here. Pay attention, listen to people, find out their story. Everybody's got a wonderful story, and find out how you can fit into their story. So we're going to leave here tonight, and I want you to know that if you'd like, you can watch this on video on marinersands.chapel.org, or if you didn't get the link, send me an email or send Nora an email at msandschapel@gmail.com, and what Nora will do is send you the link, or I'll send you the link. Okay? I'd offer opportunity for questions, but our time is up, and so I'm going to dismiss us, but Tony and I will be around if you would like to talk to us about additional things. If you'd like to take one of those or more of those of our 5 wishes, that blue document over there, you're welcome to take that with you. I have extras as well. If you don't receive our email, we send out a regular Chapel Happenings email of all the different events. If you don't have that, just let us know. You don't have to give me any of your information except just tell me, and I'll remember your name and we'll get you on the email list. We know who you are and where you live. It's a delight that you came tonight and be a part of this. And again, Tony, Nehra, thank you so much for all the information you provided for us. Good night now. Thank you.